This is an exclusive presentation of the Foreign Press Association.
Hi, and welcome to another broadcast of the Foreign Press Association and Foundation. I'm your host, Jeff Oppenheim, and I welcome you all to tonight's program, which is Liberty and Justice for Some. Can there be racial justice in the USA? Before I introduce my incredible panel tonight, I have to take care of just a few bits of housekeeping. Firstly, as you probably already know, the Foreign Press Association and Foundation is a nonprofit organization, and as such, it relies on not only public funds and corporate funds, but funds from, well, as they say, viewers like you. You can make a donation of any size, it would be greatly appreciated, and you could also become a member. You can find out information at our website, which of course is www.foreignpressassociation.org. We're also going to take a moment to introduce my co-producers for the evening. Robert Saunders, Dr. Robert Saunders is joining me tonight at the studio. Robert, good evening. He will be helping me field questions from you, the audience. So please have those questions ready. Start sending them in throughout the broadcast. I also want to thank my co-producer, Alibe Hamaker, and of course the Foreign Press Association and Foundation Executive Director, Jonathan Bruce King, who is serving as our TD tonight. So Jonathan, chapeau as they say, thank you for rolling up your sleeves and doing that. We will be recording this broadcast and then posting it probably in about 24 hours on our YouTube channel, which is simply Foreign Press Association and Foundation. And of course, this being the virtual world that we live in, I'd be remiss if I didn't invite you all to please comment, like, share, subscribe, all the requisites on our social media platforms. We're across all of them as FBA New York. And the New York there is spelled out, of course. Well, I want to introduce my panelists so we can get right into a very deep discussion. Joining us in the digital studio today is Dr. Lorenzo Boyd, a community policing consultant and professor at the Henry C. Lee College, Criminal Justice and Forensic Science. Also, Janai Nelson Esq, an attorney and associate director-counsel of the NAACP, Legal Defense and Educational Fund. Thank you for joining us. Alfreda Robinson, Associate Dean for Trial Advocacy of Law at George Washington University and President of the National Bar Association. Also joining us in the studio is Reverend David F. Telfort of the Lafayette Avenue Presbyterian Church. I understand Hawk Newsom was desperately trying to make it back to New York so he wouldn't be locked out of curfew. I believe he's in flight right now, but he may be able to call in at the end of the show. We did a little pre-tape with him anyway. I'll share that with you separately. But I want to get right to the heart of the program. As you know, we moved tonight's timing to so that we could accommodate and fall behind as we should. Barack Obama, President Barack Obama, who just addressed the nation. And he's addressing it to the same issues that we're addressing tonight. So I'd like to ask all the panelists at this point to filter through your professional lens, if you would, the one preeminent takeaway. What did he say that really is locking in with you, and why?
Well, I'll start the conversation, Jeff. Thank you so much. The main thing that I saw coming out of President Obama was he acknowledged the pain that the community is facing, particularly communities of color. And by acknowledging that pain, it helps the healing process. And the one term that he said that I think resonated more than anything else, he said, "You matter." And that's really important, acknowledging pain of the community, and that's what helps the healing.
Thank you, Dr. Boyd.
This is President Robinson. For me, it was to emphasize the power of the youth and to remind us that during the 60s, Dr. King and others, many of our members of the National Bar actually represented Dr. King and Rosa Parks. And they were young, so that he emphasized that this is an encouraging sign that we have so many young people who have come out peacefully and have been pushing us to reforms that need to occur.
Thank you.
Yes, I want to agree. I think the emphasis on the youth and the role that they can play in transforming our society was an incredibly empowering and encouraging word. The fact that he thanked young people instead of disparaging them, instead of criticizing them, instead of condemning them, he said thank you. And we really owe a debt to young people in our society, particularly young people of color and Black people in particular, who have worked over the course of this history to transform this democracy and bring us closer to our own humanity. He also made a wonderful tie between the right to vote and the issues that we are most concerned about and what protesters are most concerned about, and that the power of the vote can help remedy some of those issues in addition to protest and agitation.
Thank you, Mr. Nelson. Reverend?
Yeah, thank you. I would say that one of the things that I took away from President Obama's comments is that he really tied us back to what is causing the response that we're seeing today, which is America's original sin, which is racism and white supremacy. Him being able to call us back to that focus and remind us of the ways in which it has tracked throughout in the years really does, I think, remind us why the response has been so intense, the reason why folks in the thousands are taking to the streets. And I think that's important to name, because I think often in some media outlets that reminder of why things are so intense sometimes get lost. So I appreciated that he was able to contextualize things historically.
Thank you, Reverend. Let me ask all of you as well, obviously, both in his speech and much of what we're focusing on right now, the bulk of these protests are coming really out of the chants of Floyd. We're talking about, a few recent cases in essence. What is it about these recent cases in particular that have really, in many ways, trumped all the other cases that have come before it? But those cases seem to have really reignited racial tension and racial unrest and civil disobedience across America. What is that thread that has pushed beyond?
Well, Jeff, let me stop you right there, and let's unpack this a little bit, because it's not the Floyd case. It's not the last 2 or 3 cases. It's not the last 4 or 5 cases. It's a systemic history of cases over and over and over again. What's happening in the Black community is they're trying to grieve each loss. And as you go through the stages of grief, you start with denial, and then you move through anger, and then you go to bargaining. But the problem is, because there are so many Black people and brown people that die in the system at the hands of the police or at the hands of the criminal justice system, that the Black community doesn't get a chance to grieve. Every time they move towards bargaining, something else happens, and then they move back from the beginning. And a lot of times, in a lot of ways, it seems like the community as a whole is stuck in the anger phase of grieving. So it's not this last case. It's not the last few cases. Because remember, the people that are protesting now, their parents or grandparents were protesting a lot of the same things in the 60s. We can go back even further than that. So it's not just this one case. And I think to say that, I think does a disservice to the whole movement.
Thank you, Dr. Boyd.
I might add that perhaps we are seeing what we are seeing. We now have African Americans and others who have the ability to tape these murders in real time. And certainly George Floyd's murder, and we're glad now that the public officials are acknowledging that, was obvious to all. It was obvious to all. So I think that's why you might focus on that. But there's been a long history, systematic, institutional, and structural racism in this country, as far back and against other people of color, but certainly as far back as the first African-American ship arrived here, where we were commoditized, because what it was, we were brought here to work for free, not to be human beings, to be treated like others. But I do think it's the very graphic, you can't take your eyes away from it, that has brought us to this point.
Thank you. Thank you, President Robinson.
Yeah, if I can just add that I absolutely agree with what the other 2 panelists have said. In particular, if we suggest that it was just George Floyd's death, which was egregious, horrific, and one of the most tragic killings that I think we all have ever witnessed, but it isn't just that. We do a disservice to the Black Lives Matter movement that sprung up after Mike Brown and Eric Garner's death in 2014. It's the reason that we see Black, white, Asian, Native American, Latinx folks in the streets today holding up that powerful slogan, Black Lives Matter. We do a disservice to that movement, which sprung up from young people of color and Black people of color who say, our lives matter, and have really spawned a new movement to focus on police violence. We also do a disservice to the memory of those who were engaged in the riots in the 60s that were largely also based on police violence. If we look at the history of Bloody Sunday, Jimmy Lee Jackson was shot by police, and that was part of what precipitated the rebellion and the uprising that led not only to Bloody Sunday, but ultimately to the passage of the Voting Rights Act. So it is all these instances of agitation and protest and the willingness to put lives on the line that have led us to where we are today. And as many have already said, it's because we've never gotten full redress, because the civil rights movement never delivered the full redress that it sought, that we're here today at this explosive moment.
Thank you, Ms. Nelson. Reverend?
You know, I agree with all that the panelists have said. And, you know, just want to add that I think that what we're also seeing here is we are seeing community organizers and activists who are not letting up. And we are seeing a generation who is saying enough is enough, right? So with the release of these videos that in some ways are incredibly tragic in the ways that Black and Indigenous people of color have to relive these murders as they're broadcasted, it does also push people out into the streets. And we're also in the midst of a pandemic. So I think that when we talk about the economic loss that millions of Americans are experiencing, Black and brown communities are disproportionately so. When we are hearing the ways in which this pandemic has laid bare really the inequities in our health systems, what we are seeing here really is a perfect storm, if you will, in addition to what we're talking about, which are decades of having cries for justice not answered.
Reverend, I love how you touched on it. It really does seem like this perfect storm. In fact, with already we were flagging the inequities, the racial inequities, the disparities between the Black community and how they were being impacted by COVID. Very similar in some ways to yellow fever back at the end of the 1700s, when initially Black folks were considered possibly immune, and later to be found out they were not, of course, when it was too late. But it's interesting how history is repeating itself. The economy is in trouble, to the point that we're probably going to see these ripple effects coming out of this. And there's got to be a real fear factor going throughout the community, especially in a lower class community that's going to be impact, and already is impact, ever the harder. Let's play out those two other aspects where they're really raising the level of fear and anguish at this point.
Well, I think I'd like to really pose it this way and put the frame around it. We are in the middle of two pandemics. The first was the COVID-19 pandemic. All Americans felt it, but the African American community, other people of color, and the poor were feeling it every day. They knew they were losing loved ones immediately. They knew their small business owners were closed. They knew that their churches were closed. They knew that they had high unemployment, and now it was even higher. So that they knew all of these. We knew we had these disparities across the board, historic for decades: health, wealth, education. So then you fold into this the second pandemic of structural and institutional racism that is baked into our society. So we have right now this baked in, but what we know is that this moment in history, that this is the moment where we have to stand and say, it's equality for all, it's justice for all, and it is also the application of the rule of law to all, not just for the friends of the wealthy or those in power, but also for those who are not, for the George Floyd, for the Breonna Taylor, for let's go back to vigilante justice that was heaped upon a Black jogger, that was heaped upon Trayvon Martin. So it's across generations. And so I believe we're in this frame where we have two pandemics, and that's why we say, as many others say, in the NBA, we literally can't breathe. We can't breathe. And we're talking about how we feel emotionally. We're so hurt, we can't even articulate between our breaths what we feel like.
Thank you, President Robinson. There also was a very interesting poll just recently done by CBS, and I'd like to keep it with our attorneys as well as Dr. Boyd here, because it showed, surveying a variety of communities, their perceptions of how people were treated differently by the police, by the local law enforcement, white communities, Black communities, and how we each perceived how the other was treated. What seems to be happening to me is this, exactly what you described, President Robinson, that we're starting to now see those numbers suggest there is a consciousness rising in all communities that there is a different level of treatment with law enforcement. So I'm going to put you on the spot, Dr. Boyd, right away and say, what's your perception of that poll? What's your perception of what it's reporting? And is there reality and truth in this?
There's absolutely reality and truth. The one thing we do know is that there are different rules for different people in the criminal justice system. The one thing I push back on is that it's just now being noticed or it's just now rising. This is something that's systemic in the way policing was put together. If we go back historically, if I may dovetail what counsel said, remember policing started with slave patrols. So from the very beginning, there was a negative relationship between the police and communities of color. So fast forward to 2020 and the pandemic in New York City, we're bombarded with video footage of white residents in Central Park that are not social distancing, and police walking up, handing them masks and asking them to socially distance themselves and walking away. The flip side of that, in New York, same city, same metropolitan area, same police department, we see Black and brown people being arrested, thrown to the ground for the exact same thing. So we know there are different rules for different people. That's not new. The fact that the poll is being asked is one thing. The fact that people are noticing is one thing, but people in this community have known this forever, and they continue to march and they continue to protest. And if I may just throw a little caveat in this, I seem to remember being an avid football fan when Colin Kaepernick and the like would kneel in protest. A lot of people in white America lost their minds and said, that's not the proper way to protest. And then when people started protesting in the street like we're doing now, people are upset about that as well. Is there a proper way to protest? Is there a way to bring light to this situation? Because it's a real situation. It's really happening, and there's a real fix that people are looking for. So to say it's just now being noticed, I don't know that that's true. We've known a really long time.
Councilor Nelson, want to add to that?
A report. This is a national federal commission that told all of America that there are two Americas, separate and unequal. And we did not heed that caution. We knew that following Jim Crow, there was a civil rights movement that undid some of the state-sponsored legal apartheid that was in place, but it didn't change the structural racism that is embedded, or as Dean Robinson said, that's baked in to our society and who we are. So we've always known, as Black people, as people of color, as other marginalized groups have known, that there are two Americas. There are multiple Americas, frankly. But we know that they're based on a hierarchy, and they're based on the myth of white supremacy. And I hope that in this moment, we're ready to confront that. I know that the young people on the street will not take no for an answer, and they're saying, we will not be silenced. We will not continue to suffocate our pain. We will not continue to allow America to ignore what is obvious and what is our real lived experience by pretending it doesn't exist. And I think with people having perhaps more time on their hands during the pandemic, paying more attention to media, really getting to know some of the people in their neighborhoods and communities, that maybe we're at a point where people are willing to wake up and recognize that our destinies are linked, and there is no way that we're going to come out of something as catastrophic as a pandemic without some sense of real, I don't know, if you just want to call it reckoning, a real reckoning with our history and where we need to go together as a country.
Well, the demand for justice at this point is so great. Obviously, on the policing level, they're the first person, the first group of people to interact with the people, right? So we have, of course, the Floyd case going on right now. I have to go right to Boyd. Oh, how do we call this? Is this standard operating procedure? What went on there? What should have been done? What could have been done? What wasn't done?
Allow me to be the university professor that I am from the University of New Haven. Let me say that modern policing in a free and democratic society involves the delicate balance between invoking police power, the use of coercion, and constitutional rights. Now, in order for policing to actually happen and be effective, the public must trust and believe in the authority of the police. If we look at what our president just talked about, 21st century policing, the first pillar of 21st century policing is building trust and legitimacy. So with that being the backdrop, nothing was done in that situation. Most of the police situations that we see that come to light wasn't built on trust, wasn't built on legitimacy, and it was problematic. It was mostly what I would consider rogue cops doing the things that they were doing. So when I'm going across the country and I'm talking to community members and I'm doing community outreach, I spend the bulk of my adult life building bridges between the police and communities of color. I often say the vast majority of police officers are law-abiding, God-fearing citizens. Most cops are good people. But then the question is, where are all of these good cops when the bad cops do bad stuff? So if the good cops are standing by being complacent, doesn't that really make them complicit?
For that, we also have, of course, two other cases that are being talked about a lot during this protest. The Taylor case, which is this forced entry, gunshot fired. It's almost unfathomable, unexplainable. What happens there in that case? And then we'll talk about the Arbery case, which is a response to vigilante justice and the time it took. Break that down for us, Dr. Boyd.
Well, here's the question. Let's take it down to its most basic point. Someone lost their life that was not committing a crime, that was not doing anything. Did someone cause the death of the other person? Yes. Well, now there's culpability there. So someone is responsible for extinguishing the life of someone else. How then do we hold that person accountable? Unfortunately, in our country, we tend not to hold police accountable. And we need to do that. And when they go to court, the few times that they go to court, part of the problem is I ask community members, how many of you have ever gotten called for jury duty? Virtually every adult raises their hand. And then I ask, how many of you found a way to get out of jury duty? The vast majority of people laugh and snicker and raise their hand. That's part of the problem. We can't hold the police accountable. We can't hold others accountable if we're not at the table, if we're not on the jury, if we're not being part of the process. And if I may borrow a quote from Malcolm X, in order to dismantle the master's house, you have to learn how to use the master's tools. So you need to be part of the system and fix it from the inside.
Thank you for that, Dr. Boyd. I'm going to turn to our two attorneys because Dr. Boyd talked about holding law enforcement accountable. We have seen a verdict come down on the Floyd case. Let's get your read on that, if I could, Ms. Nelson and Ms. Robinson.
Sure. So today we learned that in the Floyd case, the 3 other officers who were involved in his killing have now been charged with aiding and abetting his murder. And Keith Ellison, who is the state attorney general, who is now overseeing that prosecution, has also elevated the charge against Derek Chauvin to second-degree murder. It was originally third-degree, but it's now second-degree murder, which involves an intentional killing of another human being. And I think that those charges are far more appropriate. Certainly the one with Derek Chauvin that elevates the charge, because it's impossible to imagine an officer kneeling on the neck of another individual who is gasping for air and calling for his mother, with a crowd of individuals around telling you explicitly that he is dying, and you continue for 8 minutes and 46 seconds to kneel and suppress the life out of him without that being intentional. And you can add to that that he remained on his neck for another 2 minutes after he stopped showing signs of life. He also ignored 2 warnings from fellow police officers who suggested that they turn him over, and Officer Chauvin said no. So I think that the charge of second-degree murder is the bare minimum that he should be charged with, and I'm pleased to see that State Attorney General Ellison saw fit to heighten the charge. We also know, though, that this is just the beginning of this case, that there are a lot of barriers, and Mr. Boyd expressed one, and that is the composition of our juries. But there's also another one that many people aren't aware of, and it's something called qualified immunity. It's a legal doctrine that is a significant obstacle to convicting police officers. It basically says that in order to hold a police officer accountable, in order to find a police officer guilty, you have to believe that he intended or she intended to violate a clearly established constitutional right or federal law. And judges have interpreted that standard so strictly that you almost never get a conviction of a police officer despite the egregious facts. I hope that that will not be the case in George Floyd's murder, and I hope that justice is served.
President Robinson?
Yes, I completely agree. I won't repeat the points that were made. Before the charge of the first officer, 3 days before that, we demanded that he be charged. For us, probable cause had already been established and charged with murder. And the 3 other officers that stood there, some that appeared, and now we know there's evidence that they probably too were involved in some compression against the lungs, that they be charged. So we're glad to see this, but it is important for us to look at this as the first step towards, if we want full justice, that these kinds of acts must result in convictions. And that if, in fact, the qualified immunity has tended to allow those who appear to be guilty, let's just say appear, to not have to be convicted, then we as those in the community, in the United States, we need to have that law change. Legislatively, we understand what's going on in the courts. We need to do the battle there. The other organizations are doing great jobs on those cases, but we also need to, as citizens, we have the right to petition our government to change the law and to change the standard.
Thank you. Let me turn to you, Reverend, too, because I want to bring you into it as someone who's actually been out there marching as well. I understand as recent as last night. So I'd love to hear sort of a ground zero report from you. I also know you're very involved with the Poor People's Campaign, which has a big march on Washington on June 20th. I'm sure you must be concerned about that in the light of what we've just recently seen outside the gates of the White House. Tell me about what you're observing there, and where does the rhetoric end? Are these peaceful demonstrations? Are they violent demonstrations?
So I'll say, first of all, that what I have witnessed and been a part of are incredible mobilizations of people who are taking to the streets to name and to witness that what we are seeing across the nation, not only in Minneapolis, but what we are seeing in Tallahassee, what we've seen in Indianapolis, all that we're seeing across this country, not just in this moment, but historically, is unacceptable. So it is a privilege to march in the streets and to see people across racial lines, people across age, generations of different folks are coming out. People across different economic lines are coming together, taking over our streets and letting it be known that we will not stand for this. And it's been incredible for me to witness the ways in which those who are passing by, maybe not even part of the demonstrations, are encouraging us on the streets, saying that they are proud of the work that we're doing. And let me just say that the violence that we are seeing far and beyond, not just here in New York City, but across the city. This is not just my but rather the testimony of organizers and those all across the country, is that there unfortunately are police officers who are at the root of this violence, that those who are going out peacefully are being shoved. As you may have seen in footage that has been shown around the weekend, that there are crowds that have barricades that are being pushed into them by police fans. So I think it's important for us to name that the majority of folks are going out using our bodies, using our voice to shed light on what is happening in this country, what has been happening in this country, and that there is violence that we are seeing at the hands of police who are being emboldened by the rhetoric coming out of 45's mouth. And so we have to really kind of question ourselves when we talk about wanting peaceful protests. I think we also have to make sure that we hold police accountable.
Have you observed this firsthand from the police side, from the policing side, or have you conversely seen acts of goodwill and good nature amongst police officers?
So all that I have seen have been peaceful protesters. All that I have seen have been folks going into the streets, exercising their rights to making sure that their voices are heard. I myself was not on the Manhattan Bridge, for example, where protesters were held on both sides of the bridge. But I have seen and told from colleagues who are on the streets at night into the late morning, seeing all of this happen. So I think it's important for us to lift up, right, that we may want to call for words like peace, but we also have to hold folks accountable, and that starts first and foremost with our police forces.
In a lot of situations, there's a very distinct difference between the protesters and the rioters. And a lot of times, if you notice the national feed, and I follow on social media all over the country, when the curfews are in effect, a lot of communities, you notice the protests start to thin out around curfew. And then you see a whole second group of people coming in under the cloak of darkness and wreaking havoc on communities. And clearly there are some protesters that stay afterwards, but the vast majority, there are two different groups. And many times, I think the commissioner in Boston acknowledged that more than half of the people that he arrested were not from the city, and many not even from the state. So there are outside forces coming in, wreaking havoc. And one of the reasons they do that is to undercut or undermine the protest and undercut the Black Lives Matter movement.
And Dr. Boyd, too, I know we've also seen news reports of sharing an act of kindness, peace officers in essence becoming just that, peace officers from Flint, Michigan, which is a city that has been so devastated by so many things. If ever there was a place for healing, even locally Schenectady, New York, there's been some incredible support from police at using this time as a time to heal and heal old wounds between the people and the police force. Can you address that at all from your perspective?
There's absolutely a lot of police officers who are, for lack of a better term, woke and understand the process, understand the pain that the protesters are going through. There's a lot of police officers that are saying that they support what the protesters are doing. So they're marching with them, they're kneeling with them. We see time and time again, the chief of patrol in New York kneeling with the protesters in the middle of the street. There was a sheriff in Minneapolis that took off his gear and marched with them in his t-shirt. And here in Connecticut, when the protesters decided to block Interstate 84, the state police went with them and kneeled with them for a period of time, and then they all walked off together. Because there's an awful lot of police officers that understand. And if there is one police officer anywhere in the country that saw the video of what happened to George Floyd and they're okay with it, they absolutely should turn in their badge because they are in the wrong profession.
Absolutely. Thank you. Yes.
If I may, Dr. Boyd, I, certainly, have seen some of the images and heard some of the same comments that you are referring to, that there are police officers who are taking a knee and some even who have joined, these protests. But I also want to name that if one taking a knee or one kind of holding hands with protests does not translate into every single day interactions with police being safe, then they mean nothing. It is a publicity stunt, right, that are there when the cameras are on. But for us to see the same police forces that are then, after taking a knee, shoving people in the back, or like you were just naming, unequal treatment when we are dealing with social distancing here in New York City. I am not here for those publicity moments and photo ops, but here for real justice and accountability.
Thank you, Reverend. Now let me keep it with you for a moment here too, because especially not only has clergy always played a very important role from the early civil rights days on forward. Here we have a situation where there's no gathering going on in churches because they've been closed because of COVID, rightly or wrongly. That's a different discussion we won't go into today. But obviously civic groups, clergy, and we also have you as well, Ms. Nelson, from the NAACP. We have a significant body of work here. Organizations, clergy being an affiliate organization, as it were. How do we mobilize them? How are organizations such as the Legal Defense Fund of the NAACP, along with Black Lives Matter, how are we marching forward together to advance this next stage of learning lessons, as it were, or to be woke, as Dr. Boyd said?
Yeah, so thank you very much for that question. So the Legal Defense Fund is actually a wholly separate organization from the NAACP. We were founded by Thurgood Marshall and in 1957 became an entirely separate law organization. But we share much of the same mission of racial justice and progress and advancement of Black people. And this moment really does present an important opportunity. You have faith leaders and you have Black Lives Matter organizers and activists who can help mobilize communities. And then you have in tandem with them organizations like the Legal Defense Fund who can seek the transformation of the legal system, who can hold institutions and individuals to account so that these efforts in the street are not for naught, that people who are willing to risk their lives are doing it because there's a possibility of real transformation. And when we see these moments of camaraderie or seeming camaraderie between the police and protesters, to me, what it says more than anything is that our community is so very starved for acknowledgement, for respect and dignity from the police force, that in their time of deepest pain, they are looking for, even if it's the smallest act of recognition, the smallest act of understanding, that is some consolation. But that is not what they came for. That is not why they are in the streets. They are not there for anyone to kneel with them or for anyone to march with them. They are there for full reform, for reimagining of community-based policing and a comprehensive idea of public safety that does not depend on violence against Black bodies.
Terrific. And I want to give the Reverend a chance.
Answer that, Jeff, if I may. The Center for Advanced Policing at the University of New Haven has the mission of bringing community members and police officers together. When we are doing training, when we're planning training, we're bringing them in because we want the lived experience. We need police officers to understand the daily plight of the people that they're actually policing, because we're trying to humanize the community and we're trying to build bridges between the police and the community. So having community members hear what the police are saying and having the police understand what community members are doing, I think that's the first step in moving toward healing and building bridges.
What you've heard here is the sort of the three tiers that must go on at the same time, or still the three drives. One is the work that groups like the Legal Defense Fund has done for years, which is to represent and bring cases that are specific violations of civil rights laws. The second is this educational piece, and bringing, as Dr. Boyd talked about, having our policing individuals, because some of them I don't think actually appear to be under any kind of constraints within the community to learn. And then there are groups like the National Bar. What we do is we advocate for change legislatively. We advocate for change through reform. And so, as President Obama referenced, and as we all know about the 21st century policing document, we are about the business with our coalition partners and independently of providing specific steps and reforms that can be done right now, because we really want to ensure that we just don't have this moment, that kumbaya moment, and all that's good. I don't mind that, but that we put in place legislation, like legislation banning chokeholds nationally, that we put in legislation that would require the immediate firing of a police officer that turns off his body or her body camera. And all of these things we can do. We've talked about these for years. We have a blueprint with that 21st century policing. And we are about the business with this third prong to reform. But all of these three are necessary even in this moment.
Thank you so much. Dr. Sanders, I think we're going to turn to questions because I see them backlogging. But before we open it up, since we do have you on the line as moderator to questions, you also have a military background, retired, of course. You have JAG experience, so you've got the military law behind you. And, of course, some service in Intel, retired, again, to qualify that. We are watching unfold right now one other aspect here, military interaction or the threat thereof. So, Dr. Sanders, to you, just before we open questions to everyone queuing up, what is your take? Is this a real threat, real and present danger, or is this just a threat?
So let's do some background here. So the Pocahontas Act, which is the duty regular federal military from policing our streets, has an exception. The exception is the Insurrection Act. And the Insurrection Act is how police ended up on the streets of LA during the Rodney King riots. And although it's 100+ years old, it's still good law. It can be invoked because the governor asked the president to help. It can be invoked because the president reaches over the governor to take action. And a third, it can be invoked when federal laws are being violated. That third point is how troops ended up in Little Rock, Arkansas, to protect students going to Little Rock to high school. So, is it a real and present danger? Well, with the current administration, it could be. We have to be concerned about what the president would like to do with federal troops to precipitate his strongman perspectives. But, so this morning, Secretary Esper said it would be wrong to put federal troops on the ground. Why did he say that? Because he was participating in a photo op where a combination of federal troops, Department of Justice personnel, Homeland Security, and National Guardsmen cleared the path of peaceful demonstrators so the president could take a photo op in front of a church. The use of our military on our streets against our people is an anathema. That's not what the American people want. Matter of fact, our Constitution says things about that when we talked about boarding soldiers of the English as part of our revolution to free ourselves. And that point, always remember that the Boston Tea Party was not a tea party, it was a riot. So when we think about these things, we need to understand where we come from and how we got here. Now, on the last point of this, so a warrior, an American hero, Secretary Mathis made a statement today. And I'm going to read it because it's very important. He said, and I quote, "Donald Trump is the first president in my lifetime who does not try to unite the American people, does not even pretend to try. Instead, he tries to divide us." He went on further to say, "We are witnessing the consequences of 3 years of this deliberate effort. We are witnessing the consequences of 3 years without mature leadership. We can unite without him, drawing on the strengths inherent in our civil society. This will not be easy, but the past few days have shown, but we owe it to our fellow citizens, to past generations that bled to defend our promise, and to our children." Former Secretary Mathis, General Mathis, United States Marine Corps career officer, he understands that when we mix certain things, they are contrary to the values and the security of our nation. When I swore my oath, I swore to defend it against all enemies, foreign and domestic. How do we define those? Who defines those? That's our problem.
Michelle, thank you. Let's turn to questions. I know we have quite a number of them waiting. What's the first one we have, and from whom?
So the first one is from, it's a combination of two questions from a young man, Ilario, and another young man named Floyd, one in Florida, one in California, and they're specifically talking about district attorneys. So directed at Ms. Nelson. So how we elect or appoint district attorneys seems to be problematic at the end state when we now need to try police. President Obama just said that all of these things need to be fixed at a local level. Do you have an opinion on how this engagement between police, district attorneys, and the community should be reformed, move forward, or adjusted?
Yes, I think that's an excellent question, so thank you to those who posed it. One of the things that the Legal Defense Fund has emphasized, and increasingly so, is that our down ballot offices are as critical as any other. So we obviously focus on presidential elections. We focus on perhaps when we're electing a new senator or congressperson in the House. But we also have an opportunity when there are jurisdictions that elect the district attorney, elect the prosecutor, we have an opportunity to decide how we are going to vet that person. Are we going to ask them ahead of time whether they believe in sentencing reform, whether they believe in juvenile life without parole, whether they believe in retributive justice and other alternatives to incarceration? We should ask those questions and understand what their policies are before they get elected. We often, and I think this is across the board, not just in minority communities, but others, just check a box if that person is in the party that we subscribe to, or if the name seems familiar. But we can be doing more to hold those individuals to account and ensure that they know if we vote for them, they need to execute policies that will protect and serve our community. And that is the job of the district attorney, not just to go after people who they deem criminals, but to represent the public and seek justice. That is their duty, and that is their oath.
So, President Robinson, could you take a look at that from the federal prosecutorial side, and as we think about U.S. attorneys and their roles in this process?
I will be glad to do that. The federal side, every U.S. attorney is nominated and confirmed by the Senate, except for the rare times where there is an immediate vacancy. But that is by the president, so that we are looking at not just the down ballots, but we have to exercise the vote quite carefully and determine this person that's going to make thousands of appointments across the federal government. Not only those who are the U.S. attorneys who prosecute, but also others that are involved in the process. There's also a need then to ask these same kinds of questions, to press it, to look at what the background is, and then to say, we really need to look at whether this is a person that we want, once they've been nominated, we want in a seat, and use the power, your constitutional right, to petition your members of Congress not to vote to confirm that person. But it starts with the president. So we have an election coming up. We're nonpartisan, and so I won't give my view. People will make the decision they want to. But very importantly, we have to remember that we have to ensure that those U.S. attorneys and others, that they take the oath and they keep the oath, that it's one nation under God, indivisible, but also that is justice for all. Very importantly, justice for all. And then the person at the top who went to the protesters, we understand, and asked that they be cleared. This is Washington, D.C., where I live. That they be cleared away for whatever reason. The president was coming. And then marched through there. And however it happened that somehow there was this peaceful march became something other than that. We did see the videos of peaceful protesters running from what appeared to be horses, what appeared to be the onslaught of some kind of explosive devices that we know were not explosive. That's not imagined. Your eyes have seen it. And so we need to keep these folks accountable. We need to hold their feet to the fire. That's where we start. And that's why we have to emphasize the ballot box and the confirmation process. And we weigh in on all the confirmations.
Thank you. Reverend Telfort, there's a combination question here for you. Heather and Carolyn asked together, what can we do to help? And specifically, what can we do to bridge the relationship between the police and the community?
So I think on the question of what folks can do to help, I'll go back to the question that was posed to Ms. Nelson and myself about kind of the ways in which different groups are coming together to respond in this moment. One of the things that, I want us to realize is we are seeing now all across the country an incredible mobilization of communities. But folks are mobilizing and speaking against a corrupt system. But we also need to have unity and organization around what it is we are articulating for the future. And chances are, in most communities, if folks are out on the streets, there are community organizations who for decades have been mobilizing for the rights of those who are at the margins. And most likely, those organizations are either seeing an uptick in folks who are reaching out to them and trying to join and trying to be part of their work. And some of them may be flying beneath the radar. So for anyone who's asking how to help, I would say try to find out who are the grassroots organizations that are organizing in your neighborhoods, tenant organizations, social justice oriented organizations that are looking out for the poor, looking out for Black and indigenous people of color, looking to make sure that the very folks that we're talking about who are languishing and dying at the hands of police or languishing in prisons, that you can make sure that you team up with them. In terms of the ways in which we bridge, the gap between communities and police, I'm sure that Dr. Boyd has much more expertise in this area. But I'll just say this one thing as a clergy person and as a person of faith. I've always seen my job, it hasn't always been easy, but a prophetic call for reimagination. So I think that there are some ways in which we can hold police more accountable through policy and legislation. But I also come from a long line and a tradition of clergy persons who ask us to reimagine our societies where people keep us safe, where communities keep each other safe, and that we can think about a world where we defund police and think about communities that keep each other safe.
Thank you. So Dr. Boyd, would you add to that if you have anything you want to talk about based on the lead-in from the Reverend Telfort, but also talk about how that affects cases like in New York City, a young man choked to death, Eric Gardner, and 5 years later, an individual is still on the police force receiving pay while his administrative case is being adjudicated and he's not been prosecuted.
One of the things that we have to look at is labor laws and how they protect people, particularly in union situations. And I spent 15 years in a union in the sheriff's department, so I understand how it works. So that's part of the problem. But I'm also going to do a paradigm shift, Doc, and I'm going to talk about how things are changing, because we're starting to see in major jurisdictions that Black and brown people are taking over police departments and doing a paradigm shift. There's the Commissioner Willie Gross in Boston. There's Gina Hawkins in Fayetteville. There's all these police chiefs. Danielle Outlaw in Philadelphia. We're starting to see when Black and brown people are taking over police departments that is starting to work its way down. What's not going to happen is they take the oath of office one day and the next day things change, because these police departments have been doing this for generations, but we're starting to see the change. And I'm a member of NOBLE, the National Organization of Black Law Enforcement Executives. And I was on the call this past Saturday, and I heard the pain and anger in the voice of a lot of these police chiefs of color seeing the stuff that's going on. And NOBLE is the social conscience of policing. But there's all these other organizations that are buying the rhetoric from the current administration and going back to a paramilitary style of policing and moving away from the stuff that President Obama talked about with 21st century policing. We can do it. It's slow. The American culture, unfortunately, is like an aircraft carrier, and making the turn is really slow. But I do see that there are some margins where it is changing. There are some places that is changing. And I felt good when I saw immediately the police officers were fired. And then when we start to see people at least being charged, that's not enough. We need to see trials. We need to see convictions. We need to see real accountability, because that helps the community heal.
Thank you. I'm gonna follow up with you for another question here. Jasmine, a student asks, I'm going into the criminal justice field. What can be done to help and support Black Lives Matters movement? And are there steps being taken to assist ending these injustices that you can help me understand that where I can engage?
Now that's immediately in my wheelhouse, because one of the things that we're doing at the University of New Haven, we're going into high schools and we're dealing with college students, and we're trying to help them build levels of empathy, because gone are the days when we try to build better cops. What we're trying to do is build better people that have levels of empathy and help usher them into levels of policing. So as your criminal justice major, as your budding practitioner, we need you to understand the lived experiences of the people that you have to police. And we start that in the classroom. We introduce things like policing fragile communities or appearance bias in crime. We help them understand the inherent biases in the criminal justice system. And the movie 13th does a really good job of explaining the biases in the criminal justice system and the levels of disparate sentencing and disparate arrests and disparate prosecutions. So if we can start, again, we're moving from the inside. So I'd love to hear the passion of criminal justice students that actually want to make a difference. And if you want that, University of New Haven is where you need to be.
Better said, I couldn't have done myself as a University of New Haven professor. Way to go. So, Ms. Nelson, one more time for you. Does the militarization of the police forces change how policing is done? And if it does, what do we need to do about it to change the dynamic, to do a paradigm shift, as Dr. Boyd just talked about?
That's a phenomenal question. Of course, when you arm law enforcement, when you arm local law enforcement with military equipment, you are sending a message that they have an enemy, that they are in combat. And the only people or individuals that they could be in combat with are the communities that they interact with every day. So you are telling them on day one that you need to be fearful of this enemy, that you need to dominate this enemy, to use the words of the person who occupies the White House, it sends a message of hostility and of a very adversarial relationship that is directly contrary to the concept of community policing and community safety, which is what we would hope to achieve, which is what I think every American expects. One of the things that the Legal Defense Fund has done to try to combat this is to trace the amount of federal funding that goes to the over 18,000 law enforcement agencies. We have a database called the National Police Funding Database.org, which identifies the federal funds that go to a subset. We can't do all 18,000, but we track some of the federal funding that goes to certain jurisdictions, and then we break it down by the type of funding that it is. So you can see how much military equipment, how much money through certain defense programs, police departments are being funded by, and that's to enable activists and organizers and communities to say, hey, you received this money, what are you doing with it? You received money for community policing, what are you doing with it? And then it enables organizations like the Legal Defense Fund to use Title VI of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 to challenge law enforcement agencies, because that law says if you engage in racial discrimination and you receive federal funding, you can be brought to court and you can be held accountable. So that is a mechanism not only for transparency and public education, but also one for greater accountability of law enforcement agencies.
Dr. Sanders, I think we're going to have to hold questions there. We are running out of time. This has been such an informative program. If we didn't get to your question, my apologies, but please visit us when we post this video in about 24 hours, and you can post in the comments section. You can post your question there, and we will try and answer it remotely. You can also use social media, of course. Once again, we are the FPA at New York, at FPA New York. You can find us there. The New York is spelled out. I want to thank my panelists. This has been such an incredible and informative panel. Certainly tonight, we share in the sentiment, we share in the cause, absolutely. So much more work to do. And on that note, I want to close out tonight's program a little bit differently. If I may impose on the Reverend, I want to keep in mind the civil rights movement of the 60s, where we were led by wonderful clergy, Dr. Martin Luther King amongst them. And I think in keeping with that, if I can impose on the Reverend to lead us out in prayer in just a moment, I would greatly appreciate that. I will say my closing to you tonight. Firstly, I want to remind you from the Foreign Press Association that we are here for you. We are a bright light in journalism, and in supporting us, you are also supporting, especially at this critical moment, the free press and the freedom of speech. So ever the more so important now, I encourage you to lift your voice and support us by clicking in, liking, and sharing our videos and our feed. On that last note, I want to say good night to everybody. From my part, I thank you for joining, and until the next time, be safe, be well, and let's be united. Reverend, please.
Let us pray. Divine Spirit, many of us call you by different names, but tonight we call you justice, freedom for all people, and righteous discontent. We pray you will lead us in this time. We pray you keep the fires of justice burning until a new system can emerge. We pray you will expose the lies of our world and the truth of justice. Meet us in our pain, hear our cries of lament. May our work now lead to a new world where all people can truly be free. In the name of all that is just and protects Black life, we pray. Amen.
Thank you for joining us for this broadcast. To learn more about our digital forums and programs, please subscribe to our YouTube channel. For membership information, please visit www.foreignpressassociation.org and on Twitter at FPA New York. This has been an exclusive presentation of the Foreign Press Association.